Okay, welcome everybody. It's December 21st, and once again we have amazing guests with us. We have Dr. Fuz Rana and Dr. Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe, who have joined us prior in the past a couple times. This is Dr. Ross's second time with us, and Dr. Rana's third time with us. So, for those who don't know who they are, let me give you a quick bio on these gentlemen. Dr. Hugh Ross is the founder of Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to the integrating scientific fact and biblical faith. His books include Why the Universe is the Way It Is, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, and Navigating Genesis. Dr. Fuz Rana, who's the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He is the author of several groundbreaking books, including Who is Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell Design, which I'm actually reading now, and The Dinosaurs, Blood, and the Age of the Earth. He holds a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. And also with us, we also have Dr. Frank Steiner. Dr. Frank Steiner came to Hillsdale College in 1986. He served as the Dean of Sciences, is now the Chair of Biology. Prior to that, he did 2 years as a visiting professor in microbiology and holds an MS and PhD in microbiology from Ohio University. Anyways, guys, welcome back, everybody. Seems like you're just here.
Yeah, it's good to be back. We're glad to be with you guys.
Thank you very much. I think the topic tonight we decided was going to be a little bit on intelligent design and the advocacy position of old Earth creationism and reasons to believe from an intelligent design standpoint. Correct?
Sure.
Correct.
In going through your book, I'm going to turn this over to he asked if we just call him Frank. I'm going to turn it over to him in a few seconds because like I said, I went through a lot of the cell design. I thought it was a wonderful primer on biology. I'm actually going to use it for reference. I liked it. But I'm going to turn it over to Frank, who actually did his personal review on it, and some of the slight criticisms as far as where intelligent design starts and where science maybe interacts with it. Because one of the things in our community we have a hard time understanding is the intelligent design advocacy position from a scientific standpoint. So, Frank, what question do you have for Dr. Rana, specifically in regards to the intelligent design in relationship to the book, The Cell Design?
Well, I guess first of all, I'd like to say hello to both of you gentlemen. Nice to meet you, Dr. Ross and Dr. Rana.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice to meet you too.
And Dr. Rana, I think you're a grad of OU. Is that correct? Is that where your PhD?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we have a mutual acquaintance. Did you know or work with a Dr. Malcolm Modrikowski by any chance?
I sure did. In fact, my advisor, Jack Blazik, and I collaborated with Malcolm on quite a few projects. I actually spent as much time working in his lab as I did in my lab. So we worked on the interaction of these antimicrobial peptides called meganins with
Oh yeah.
bacterial, gram-negative bacterial membranes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I took an immunology course from Malcolm.
Oh, interesting.
Kind of kept in touch with him. And I actually, when I was in Massachusetts, I actually was friends, sort of had a mentor relationship with his father-in-law, which was Dr. Cox, who was sort of the founding member of really what became NIH. So he kind of took me under his wing at UMass, and so he made a little connection there. So so I mean, I had great years at OU there at graduate school, and just a couple of years ago took some of my undergraduates back. I'd never actually been back to Athens since graduation, and took some of our students back for a Tri Beta convention there, and
good.
back in Grosvenor Hall and all that kind of stuff. So that was great. Back a lot of memories. My office was the Animal Building, directly across from Clippinger, right across the railroad track, if you know where that is.
Well, I lived in Clippinger basically for 5 years.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I had Dr. Peter Johnson was a member of my committee when I was there.
Yeah, I knew Peter very well. His office was just down the hall from my lab.
Yeah, so it's kind of a roundabout story that I got asked to do that review on your book. I don't honestly remember how it came about, but I was sort of intrigued by the title, and I think actually someone from Spring Arbor College asked, which is just up the road from us in Hillsdale, which is sort of southern Michigan. I don't know if you know where that is or not, sort of where Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana come together. And Hillsdale is kind of an unusual place. It's one of only two small colleges that don't accept any federal money whatsoever. So we have a very strong and thriving science program there, of which I was sort of the leader of for many years, and got our undergraduates involved in research projects, and we send a lot of our students off now to graduate school and professional schools as a result. So, so science is a very important and large part of our curriculum, despite our school is a liberal arts institution, and we really stress the importance of a liberal arts education. And in fact, we're incorporating a lot of the classical concepts, including a new logic and rhetoric course that's going to be required of all our freshmen here this coming year. So anyhow, long story short, I got asked to if I would consider doing a review on your book called The Cell's Design, and I was intrigued because I teach some. Let me make it clear. For the last 30 years, I teach at the undergraduate level. So I teach classes in molecular and cell biology. Microbiology is my background. I actually taught biochemistry when I was at Rutgers, and I taught it when I came to Hillsdale as well. And I was intrigued by the book's title, because I thought, wow, that would be maybe a great book to use in one of my upper level classes, which is advanced cell biology, for instance. There's a great book put out by ASM that I use in that class. So I was kind of using that book in comparison. And I really love the artwork, by the way. I thought the artwork was very good in your book. But
did you draw all those things yourself, by the way?
Oh, no, no.
Okay.
No, we have actually people that have artistic talent and training that we collaborate here. So.
Yes. Well, Steve's comment about using the book as a primer, I thought was, maybe most appropriate, and that's kind of the way I approached it. And I thought, wow, this might even be good for maybe one of my non-majors classes. But I guess my basic complaint is that or criticism, there's really no working scientific hypothesis or explanation of what's described in the book. It's sort of a summary of what was known at the time from a variety of biochemistry books, as well as articles out there in various subcellular components or subcellular structures of the working cell. And then there's really not any attempt to put everything in the context of how everything goes together. It just sort of ends up saying, well, this particular structure or this particular piece of coding biomolecules, they're too complicated, they're too complex to possibly have been anything else but designed. And, I used to hire a lot of people when I was Dean of Sciences. I once went to an interview, and one of the candidates was there. He was a developmental biologist, and he kept talking about how great this structure was, and isn't this beautiful, et cetera, but he made no connection about where this particular tissue came from, or what particular adaptation this tissue or bone allowed an organism to facilitate. And so it's just kind of like you get to the end of all these descriptions, beautiful descriptions, but there are some, I think, some errors and common oversights that probably were missed. But then it's sort of like the pin comes along and pops the balloon, and then everything is deflated, and there's no place to go. And it's sort of my comment about sort of all dressed up and no place to go. That part of the still there?
Yeah. I was just gonna let's give Dr. Rana a chance to respond.
I'll finish up my statement. Part of the idea of doing science is it's a process, and that's the fun of science. And the challenge of science is sort of how we know, and there's nothing there about how we know. It all comes to the conclusion that this is way too complicated, and hence it must be a designer, and that's the end. There's no working hypothesis, no working explanation for these miniature submolecular mechanisms.
Yeah, well, let me go ahead and offer just some comments, and I actually will invite Hugh to jump in too, because one of the things that we struggle with here at Reasons to Believe is to essentially distinguish ourselves from the intelligent design movement. So both Hugh and I are advocates of intelligent design, but I don't think that we would necessarily embrace all the facets of the intelligent design movement that is essentially the product of the Discovery Institute. And so in that book, and I find this oftentimes in terms of things that I produce that are ID related in the context of biochemistry, is that many times the criticisms that are leveled against the Discovery Institute are leveled against my work, when many times I'm not sure that those criticisms are actually apropos, although I'll give you a chance to respond. But what we were trying to do in the cell's design is really not present a scientific model of sorts. This is, in my view, really a philosophical or a theological argument for design, and hence God's existence, using a design argument, following in the footsteps of the classic work of William Paley, where we try to construct and revisit kind of a watchmaker argument approach to intelligent design, or to, again, the design argument. So, the fact that you're not seeing, quote unquote, a scientific idea or a scientific theory emerging out of that, I think is somewhat understandable, because that wasn't really the emphasis of the book. Again, it was really a theological, philosophical work where scientific insight was informing it. And so the approach that I take, again, is to argue for design employing analogy in the way that William Paley made that argument. So I would call it a watchmaker type argument. But I would maintain that the argument is going beyond just simply saying, look, this is complex. It's too complex to be explained through evolutionary mechanisms. What I do in the introduction of the book is I lay out what I call an intelligent design pattern. And so the idea here is that human beings, when we function as design agents, have certain telltale signatures that we leave behind in those systems or objects or products we design. And can we see those same kind of signatures in biochemical systems, and hence, through the use of analogy, construct an argument for design? Now, there are places in the book, like when it comes to the origin of cell membrane systems, when it comes to the origin of the genetic code, when it comes to things like biochemical convergence, where we do point out what we see to be shortcomings with kind of a blind watchmaker approach to explaining the genesis of those systems. But by and large, the intent of the book was to essentially revisit the argument that Paley advanced, particularly focusing on the criticisms that David Hume leveled against that argument. Now, there's other work that we've done, Creating Life in the Lab, Origins of Life, where we basically identify what we think to be significant scientific deficiencies with chemical evolutionary explanations, and hence a blind watchmaker approach to the origin of life, and hence the origin of biochemistry. So that's what I was attempting to do in the book. Now, I do believe that there are ways in which one could take that concept and actually develop a scientific program, or at least facets of the scientific program out of it. So for example, in the book, I talk about the watchmaker prediction, where, if we're arguing that there's analogies between biochemical designs and human designs, and that we can recognize those analogies as we progress with technology, that we would argue that as we develop and invent new technology, that we would expect to see, as that new technology is developed, instances where we see that technology actually already existing in the cell. So that's a place where you could make a prediction if one really wanted to. I would also argue that the idea of having an intelligent design pattern is something that lends itself to even potentially quantitative characterization, because in a sense what you're doing is you're saying we can employ pattern recognition methods and say, okay, here is a design, intelligent design pattern. We can figure out ways to quantify those patterns and then do quantitative comparisons similar to what one would do if you're searching, an infrared spectral library looking to match your unknown infrared spectrum with already known infrared spectra. So it'd be a similar kind of application. So anyway, that was what I was trying to do in the book. So I think what I was doing is a little bit more than just simply saying this is too complex that we can't really explain it, therefore it's design. It really was trying to produce a rigorous argument for design following after William Paley.
Yeah, and the comment I would add, because I do think you make some valid points about the book, but Fuz and I have produced several books, and particularly Fuz, I think you need to understand that the cells design is part of a trilogy. We have Origins of Life, Creating Life in the Lab, and those books kind of really lay out our model. But I do agree with you that the model approach isn't as explicit in the cells design as it is in Creating Life in the Lab and Origins of Life. And you're raising a point in that it's really important for us to constantly distinguish ourselves from the intelligent design movement. And so we're speaking on university campuses, that's the first thing we have to do. Tell the audience, look, we've been doing intelligent design for a good 10 years before the intelligent design movement existed, and we do it in a different way. We do it in the context of a testable creation model, where we identify the creator, we take a stand on the length of time life has been here on planet Earth, we try to integrate across the different scientific disciplines. So for example, what you notice in Origins of Life, I'm an astronomer, Fuz is a biochemist. What we try to do is, in the context of our testable creation model, look at all the scientific disciplines and see how they integrate on the question of the origin of life. And the biggest complaint I hear against the Discovery Institute and the intelligent design movement is that they don't really have a model. It's not testable, it's not falsifiable, it's not predictive, which is why we go to pains in a number of our books to show how our model can be put to the test, how it can be falsified by scientific investigation. And as Fuz was pointing out, we try to aggressively make predictions based on our model of what future scientific research will uncover or not uncover.
Fuz, you said you possibly employ pattern recognition techniques in order to recognize signs of intelligence. Is that based upon what you had written about what Dembski has said about the filtering? Based upon this filter that he used, if an event, system, or object is intentionally produced by a designer, then it will be, he had three things. One, be contingent. Two, be complex. And three, display an independently specific pattern. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes and no. I'm actually, in the cells design, I'm mildly critical of the explanatory filter of Dembski, because in a sense, he's asking a sequence of yes-no questions of which you can't answer necessarily yes or no. And so if you've got a sequence of yes-no questions that are organized in this, flowchart manner, and you can't necessarily answer yes or no to those questions, then the filter, quote unquote, gets clogged. So for example, Dembski would argue, is the phenomena explained through natural law or as a consequence of natural law? The second thing is explained through contingency or through chance? Well, when you talk to origin of life researchers, they do talk about, is the origin of life a necessity? Is it chance? But what they're using those concepts categorically differently than Dembski's using them, where many origin of life researchers would say, actually the origin of life is both a combination of law and chance. And the question is life's origin inevitable given the different chemical and physical processes that have been proposed to explain the origin of life, or is it an occasional outcome? That's what they mean when they talk about, is the origin of life chance or necessity? So when I tried using the filter to look at essentially the origin of life question, I couldn't get past the first question. And so I don't see that as a particularly valuable approach. Now, I actually do like Dembski's concept of specified complexity, where Dembski is basically saying, look, it's not just simply complexity that's a marker for design, but that there's a pattern or an independent, I guess, patterning or specification to that complexity. And in a sense, that's very similar to William Paley's concept of contrivances. He talks about biological systems and man-made systems as being contrivances. And when I talk about an intelligent design pattern, I would say that you could essentially say it's a similar concept to specified complexity or Paley's concept of contrivances. That is, we're kind of converging in the same general area where we basically are saying there's just certain features that reflect the work of a designer, and those features then can become markers or indicators of design. And you could then, in a sense, formalize those markers into a pattern that would be, you know, again, something that you could then apply as to compare what we know about certain features of a biochemical system. And if those patterns match, then you can say, well, that biochemical system looks like it's the handiwork of a mind, if you will.
But also what's missing from the filter is function and purpose. You can make the filter far more effective if you begin to identify specified purpose and function, like, you know, the origin of life. If it doesn't happen as early as it does in the history of the universe, there's no possibility of getting the equivalent of human beings.
Okay. Joe, do you want to follow up on that? I want to bring you in on this, and this is kind of...
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, we can see you great, man.
Okay, cool. I was just, earlier there was a mention of predictions, and I think that's a great way to go about showing that your hypothesis is scientific. I was just not sure how you guys actually go about making, you know, legitimate predictions with the model, because I imagine the designer in question can design anything. I mean, if we look at the intelligent design, I guess, paradigm, and they say, well, we would expect to see, irreducibly complex little tiny systems if there was an intelligent designer. It always struck me as odd because the intelligent designer could design really simple systems. What's stopping the intelligent designer from doing that? And so I'm hearing from you guys, and I heard in a previous interview with Dr. Fuz, that the intelligent designer would design things with like it being optimal or something. But I'm not sure what the argument is for why the intelligent designer would have this idea that, oh, everything has to be optimal. Like, it seems to me like there's plenty of things out there.
Uh-oh.
We can't hear you.
Did we lose you, Joe?
Must have lost him.
I mean, let's go ahead real quick.
Yeah, go ahead and follow up on from there. Sure.
Can I respond to some of those comments?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think what you've just explained is really outside the realm of science. And that's one of the, I could not tell, nor could my colleagues, tell the difference between reasons to believe and the ICR Institute, for instance. We saw no difference in any of the jargon, any of the comments that are made at the end of each chapter. You know, one of the things that I promote at my college is scientific literacy. We have a big problem with that in our population. I mean, when we have more than almost 50% or more that think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, this being the 21st century, that to me is unbelievable. And so that's one of the roles that I have as an instructor, whether it's for non-majors or majors or upper level majors, is to get the idea of how science is done across. And by introducing this intelligent designer, who's to say that that's not the devil? Who's to say that that's not some little gnomes, some little subatomic gnomes that are putting together these little pieces? Once you start bringing in an explanation from outside the realm of the physical, it's no longer science. And that's the problem that the majority of scientists have with this sort of an argument. There's this thing that I say to my students often, in science, just saying something is so does not necessarily make it so. And even if you have an analogy in more of a philosophical context, it does not necessarily hold up as analogous in a physical context, in the basis of the components that are working in a flagellum or a membrane or in a cascade mechanism like chemotaxis, or like the blood clotting mechanism, or how viruses assemble. To me, in all the different classes that I've been involved in and all the different topics that I've taught and subjects that I taught, I see themes. I see themes that process of natural selection, natural physical, chemical, and biological processes use over and over and modify. And just to take an example, take a protoporphyrin ring. You put iron in it, you've got a He molecule. You put magnesium in it, you've got chlorophyll. You put cobalt, and you got cyanocobalamin. So, and they're just, and the world of molecular biology has literally just burgeoned. You know, when I got my PhD in '86, we had people doing manual single DNA gels, autoradiographs, and we had P32 all over the place, you know, in the laboratory. And today, you know, we're able up the road at Michigan State to sequence an entire genome of a bacterium in about 2 days' time. And all the information that has literally exploded in the last 2 decades has, if anything, has done more to defeat this idea of irreducible complexity, in my opinion, than anything. So I think this whole movement is kind of going backward. And I think it's really needs to concentrate on what the process of science is, and to kind of concentrate on how it can get at some of these questions that you do pose in your book, in terms of origins of even bacteriophage. I was thinking about today, like, where do those things come from? You know, and viruses, what a marvelous example of self-assembly. But I'm not going to say that that virus, on all its little component parts, was designed. It's a lesson in sort of the ultimate packaging engineer that interacts with his host and can make new virus particles.
Does Fuz want to respond to that, or actually does Hugh? Either or.
I guess I'm, you know, I'm not. I guess I'm struggling a little bit to understand precisely what your point is.
Well, my point is
your point, Frank, that by introducing the idea that there's a mind behind everything, or that there may be design that's evident in biological systems, somehow causing a hindrance to the scientific enterprise, or
no, I don't think it's a hindrance to the scientific enterprise. It's just not staying within the realm of science.
So you're saying, Frank, it doesn't follow along methodological naturalism. It falls outside the purview.
Well, in terms of the actual process of science, yeah, not philosophical.
I don't see that as an issue. I mean, I do archaeology, and I posit that there's a mind behind things that are found all the time. The issue is I can do that because I have background information with human beings. Human beings, I know, will make things, will make knives and stuff and all that and everything. And that's justified by the fact that I've seen people do it today and everything. So I can make these predictions, and these predictions have substance to them. But when we're talking about an intelligent designer or just a designer, we don't really have much to go on. I'm not really sure what justifies the reason why the designer would make super duper complex little micro like molecules and all this stuff exactly. Well, because they would make any like they would make super simple molecules and everything. I'm not really sure what justifies that.
Well, let's let Fuz actually respond to this.
Yeah, well, let me just make a comment real quickly. You know, as you're mentioning, when you do archaeology, you are positing intelligent agency as an explanation for the artifacts that you find, and you're making that you have background information because you know human beings do that very thing. But if you go back further in time in the archaeological record, where you're looking at, for example, the stone tools that were discovered in the 1950s, I believe, by the Leakeys, prior to the discovery of Homo habilis, where here it wasn't clear at that particular point in time if you had any kind of agent, quote unquote, capable of producing artifacts through some kind of, again, intervention or interaction with the materials in nature. But you have these stone tools that were clearly, produced by some kind of mind outside the physical and chemical processes that would, happen in the geological record. And so on that basis, they were then, able to identify the fact that here's this creature Homo habilis that was making those stone tools. So independent of having that knowledge as to whether or not there were creatures at that time that had that capability, they basically recognized that must be the case because they were able to discover those stone tools. And so, likewise, I would argue that, when you look at, again, biochemical systems, I mean, there are two explanations that are essentially in play. When you look at the history of biology, prior to Darwin, it would have been, if you look at the work of William Paley and then Sir Richard Owen, they would argue there was a mind behind what we saw in biology, and they very much saw things as the product of a mind, as the work of a designer. In fact, William Paley, as a natural theologian, was essentially trying to look at biological systems and argue, do we see evidence for a designer, and what can we infer about the nature of that designer from the evidence that we see? So it's very much a similar kind of exercise that you would see anthropologists engaged in when they're going back further in time in the archaeological record, looking at what the different hominids would have produced. It's a very similar kind of activity that I don't see that it's anti-scientific in any sense.
Well,
I don't think it's oh, I'm sorry. I can't. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we got to be careful too, not to frame science in such a way that it becomes more impotent than it really is. So, for example, the comment that science can't explore the supernatural. Well, in astronomy, we're able to establish there's a beginning to the universe. Through the space-time theorems, we know there must be a causal agent beyond space and time that created space and time. So there is something outside of matter, energy, space, and time that science is able to explore. And we're making the point about how different we are, say, from the intelligent design movement. Because we specifically identify who that designer is, we can make specific scientific predictions and compare it with, say, non-theistic predictions. I'll give you an example. From a biblical perspective, we have God wanting to bring human beings on the cosmic scene at a particular time. That requires that the origin of life be as early as the laws of physics would permit, and that first life be very diverse and complex. And so we have a prediction on the table from a Christian biblical perspective what Earth's first life should look like, how abundant it should be, how diverse it should be. And we can actually look for the fossils of Earth's first life and see if it matches those characteristics, or if instead it matches the characteristics you would get from a non-theistic perspective. And we've written books to the effect that there is a place where we can find the fossils of Earth's first life. We argue we'll never find them on planet Earth because Earth's geology has destroyed those fossils. But we're going to find them in pristine form on the surface of the moon. Well, I've been advocating for over a decade, we need to go back to the moon with a different mission, not to recover, pristine lunar rocks, but to recover Earth-transported soil, look in that soil, and see what the fossils of Earth's first life look like, to see which of all the different perspectives across the philosophical perspective actually got the correct answer. So we've made a prediction on that basis. Several other people have made a prediction. We can go there and see who got it right and who got it wrong.
And let me just add one thing real quickly, and then we'll let somebody else jump in. In the cell's design, I make it very clear that I think the designer is the God of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian description of God. And in fact, I justify the use of human designers as a template to look for design in biochemical systems by evoking the concept that human beings are made in the image of God. And if we're made in the image of God, then the expectation is that what we do is going to reflect in some capacity, though in a limited way, what the creator of the universe and the creator of human beings would have done. And so, in fact, there's a review of the cell's design, I think on Amazon, where an intelligent design proponent said that they were infuriated that I would actually identify the designer in that way, and said that they threw the book across the room when they read that. They were so angry. And so I think, you know, to Hugh's point, by identifying the designer as being the God of the Bible, we can make very specific predictions as to what we would expect nature to look like. And so that's why, you know, we would argue that optimal designs is actually something that you would anticipate being, you know, the work of the God of the Bible. In fact, if there's a critique that I think has some real potency against our version of the design argument, it would be pointing out so-called bad designs or flawed designs in biochemical systems and biological systems in a general sense, because you would not expect those kind of systems to be the product of the God of the Bible. And so, you know, I think as Hugh's pointing out, by identifying the designer, we can actually, again, make predictions as to what that design should actually look like.
Daniel, do you have a clarifying point that you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just, hey Hugh and Fuz, I just wanted to ask, so are you postulating something like what Leibniz postulated, that the best of all possible worlds is now, but God at the same time is a creative designer where there's many worlds he could create. So he chose this particular creation to bring about an ultimate good, and hence all the designs that you're talking about. And then, you know, in Christian theology, you're looking forward to that ultimate design.
Yes, in the sense that part of the creator God of the Bible's plan is that our planet eventually will be able to house billions of human beings with significant technology. And this would mandate, for example, the origin of life would look very different than a model where you don't have humans at all, or you don't have billions of humans, or you don't have technology. And so, for example, our origin of life model is based on the fact that we're going to see many different species of microbes, including photosynthetic microbes, because, you know, God wants to bring about this eventual end. And so, from that perspective, we would argue that you can draw a number of predictions scientifically about what the history of life should look like, the origin of life should look like, and what kind of astronomical history we should expect the solar system to proceed through as it's born in our galaxy. The fact that we would have to be born in a very different place than where we are now in order to get the elements we need for advanced life.
I'm gonna bring in Jack Angstrom.
Astronomically put to the test.
Jack, are you with us? I know you're on a phone too. Can you hear us, Jack?
Yeah, is this sound okay?
Yeah, actually sound really good. What question do you have to ask? You've
well,
been waiting. I'm
see,
sorry. I finally got you.
It sounds like if there are going to be fossils that are discovered or something, I think he said fossils, Dr. Ross said fossils that are discoverable on the moon, right? That doesn't sound like an ad hoc prediction to me. The problem, though, is that nobody's discovered that, and it doesn't sound like they have any argument as to why we should think that's a good place to look, right? They're just starting from their belief in the Bible. But why would anybody believe that the God of the Bible is a good hypothesis, right? If all you have is a bunch of ad hoc explanations, right, that you're using the God of the Bible to explain, right, I don't see why that's better than the pink fairy hypothesis, right? Because I'm just not aware of there being any good arguments to believe the God of the Bible. Yeah, I mean, it's good that you finally have constructed the hypothesis in such a way that it can actually be tested if we send rockets to the moon, right? But it doesn't look like that's going to happen, right? So
Well,
if it
I
doesn't
think we
happen,
will.
there isn't really any good reason to believe. I mean, there certainly isn't any good reason to believe your hypothesis as it stands, right? Since you're waiting for evidence of that kind, right? So the question is, why would we have a good reason to invest the money in developing rockets to test the one non-ad hoc prediction you've been able to offer, right?
There's a good response to that in the sense that our origin of life model has already passed a number of predictive tests. It's something we detail in our book, Origins of Life. So the fact that we have a really good track record of having our predictions proven to be correct, I think would give some motivation. Hey, let's go to the moon. And just to be clear, there's been quite a bit of research already done on the fossils of Earth's first life on the moon. So for example, papers have been published in the astronomical literature determining how much Earth material we expect to be on the surface of the moon. It literally adds up to 20,000 kilograms for every 100 square kilometers. You know, 1 ton of Earth's soil, we'd expect to find 100 quadrillion microbes. So it's already recognized in the astronomical community, the best place to look for the fossils of Earth's first life is the moon. Secondarily, Mars. But if you go to Mars, we're now down to just 200 kilograms, not 20,000 kilograms. The moon is the best place. It's the cheapest place to go. We already have the technology we need to do the job. And so the fact is, what I'm understanding is that the Chinese scientists are quite interested in going to the moon and finding those fossils. So if NASA doesn't do it, the Chinese Space Agency will.
So
Dr.
you're
Ross,
saying
would that, one sec, Jack, would that be the primordial moon? Like the moon's like 4.5 billion years old, right? Or would that be like from impacts later on when after life started being developed?
Well, the reason why the moon is such a good option is that most of the Earth's soil that's been transported to the moon happened shortly after the origin of life on planet Earth. That's when Earth was receiving the heaviest bombardment of asteroids and comets. So if you go to the moon, you have a high likelihood of finding pristine fossils of Earth's first life. There's also been research papers published making the point that that era right at the origin of life on planet Earth is when you had the efficient transport of Earth's soil and how that transport would have had soft collision on the moon. So in other words, there's a good probability that the impact of the soil on the moon was soft enough that those fossils will be preserved in pristine form.
I just want to understand. So you're actually saying that the biblical model has already made non-ad hoc predictions, which is to say predictions of novel facts that have been empirically confirmed, that are logically derivable from the hypothesis?
For example, in a number of books, for example, Origins of Life, Who Was Adam, those are 2 books that I was involved in. We actually, look at the different creation accounts that are found in Scripture, and from those creation accounts, essentially draw out what we think would be predictions that scientists should discover if indeed those creation accounts reflect a divine natural history of sorts, that they are describing real events in the history of the Earth and the history of life on Earth. And so those constitute predictions. And when the books are written, the best you can do at the time is evaluate those predictions based on what's known. And so, of course, the criticism immediately is that what we're doing is we're reading things into the text, that these are nothing more than retrodictions after the fact. But
Right.
Origins of Life was published in 2004. Remarkably, when I go back and read the book, it's still largely germane.
It's not so much germaneness that I was interested in, right, as I want to actually see how you have a hypothesis, right, that predicts a novel fact, right, that's logically derivable from the hypothesis, right, as a prediction,
okay, let me
right,
give you,
and that prediction is that confirmed. So what would be what I want you to do is take me through that. Give me something
Okay, let me give you
that
one.
your model predicts. Show me how it predicts it, and then tell me what the evidence is that confirms it, and show me how that's not an ad hoc prediction.
Okay. Okay, so let me give you an example related to what Hugh's been discussing. And again, I think it does factor into even the discussion we're having about the cell's design. But I mean, we would argue that, and won't go into the exegetical argument, that essentially what would be akin to the origin of life is being described in Genesis 1:2. And so Genesis 1:2 is a picture of the earth in its primordial state. So from that, you can actually get predictions relating to when life would originate on earth and what would be the conditions of the earth when life would originate. And the depiction of the early earth that's found in Genesis 1:2 is in effect of a water world where it would be a harsh, hostile environment. That's kind of all embodied in the Hebrew translation of the phrase tohu, formless and void, or it's tohu vabohu in the original Hebrew, right? So that constitutes a prediction that life would appear early on the earth under hostile conditions.
In a water world.
In a water world. Now that's actually, if you look at the history of thinking about the origin of life, starting again in the 1950s, when Stanley Miller's experiments inaugurated it as a formal scientific discipline, the expectation is that the origin of life would be a protracted, drawn-out process that would require billions of years. There's quotes that we've identified of people making those very predictions, and that it's kind of emerging in this warm little pond idea that Darwin wrote about in letters to his friends. And so the idea that life would originate on early and it would seem to originate very rapidly under harsh, hostile conditions is a novel prediction in light of the thinking that's permeated much of the history of the origin of life. And of course, now what we're discovering is, with an abundance of geochemical and even fossil evidence now that goes back to 3.8 billion years, that it looks as if life was present on Earth almost as soon as the Earth could conceivably sustain life at 3.8 billion years. There's even an argument, though I think the data is really not very firm, that life may have even originated about around 4 billion years ago on the early Earth. But the fact is that you have a very short period of time for life to originate, and the conditions in which life is originating is in the midst of the late heavy bombardment, as Hugh has been talking about. And the geochemical and the fossil evidence seem to indicate that even at that point in time, you're looking at a very rich microbial ecological system on the Earth, where there's a variety of different metabolic lifestyles that exist. So that's an instance where, again, it's a novel prediction. When we wrote the book, there was, evidence that we knew about that seemed to indicate that prediction actually was a valid prediction. But it's been 12 years since the book was published, and in that time, the case for a very early appearance of life on Earth has only gotten stronger and stronger and stronger, because even in 2004, it was really a controversial idea. And part of what made it so controversial was it was completely counterintuitive to what the scientific community would have expected. In fact, I even, around the time in the early 2000s, there were even people arguing that the late heavy bombardment could not have actually happened because we have evidence for life appearing so early in Earth's history, and there's no way that life could have originated under those kind of conditions, because those conditions would have frustrated the origin of life or would have obliterated life as it appeared on the planet. So that's an instance that I could point to where there's a novel prediction. You could argue initially that maybe it could be considered a retrodiction, but in the intervening 12 years, that prediction is out there now, and that prediction could have been overturned. It could have been falsified by work.
Well, one thing we do have reasons to believe is we'll put out an initial book, say The Origins of Life. First edition was published in 2004. But in 2014, we came out with a second edition where we provided the links to a number of articles on our website, basically showing how well did the predictions we made back in 2004, how well were they fulfilled by advancing scientific research during that past decade. And we just came up with a book this year where we push it one step farther and say, okay, part of our model was that we would expect photosynthetic life to be there right at the base of the origin of life. And that was a highly controversial idea in 2004. The fact that we'd have life that complex that early. But what has happened in the past 18 months is the recognition that photosynthetic life actually played a critical role in jump-starting plate tectonics. It's no accident that we have the same date for the launch of aggressive plate tectonics as the origin of photosynthetic life on planet Earth, and the recognition that photosynthetic life would have to be diverse in its speciation, and also that have to be very abundant in order to explain why we have such an early and aggressive start to the plate tectonics. And of course, that's crucial in order to bring about human beings as rapidly as only 3.8 billion years after the origin of life. And so this is something we're committed to do at Reasons to Believe, is keep coming out with new editions of our books where you can actually see for yourselves how well we did or how well we did not do in the predictions that we made in the earlier editions.
And not to belabor the point, but another example would be the book Who Was Adam? That book was published 2005, where again, we took a similar approach where we developed a set of predictions relating to the question of human origins. In 2014, we came out with an expanded edition where we left the original book intact so that people could see exactly what we predicted and exactly what we said. And then we had an additional 150 pages that looked at what we considered to be the most significant discoveries in anthropology and evaluated how those discoveries impacted our model with regard to our original predictions. And we identify places where we actually made predictions that were successful, continued to be successful, and predictions that we made that actually turned out not to be valid predictions, forcing a revision in terms of how we thought about some things. And again, the idea is that to try to create this sense of transparency, but to say that, again, it's possible to treat the idea of God's role in bringing about the origin and the history of life in scientific terms. You know, I think to one of Frank's points, and it feels like we've been talking too long, we should give you guys a chance. I don't think, and I'll let Hugh speak for himself, but I don't think our objective here at Reasons to Believe is to transform the way science is done, but rather what we're arguing is that there's nothing in the scientific record that essentially undermines belief in God or an embrace of kind of the historic Christian faith. And in fact, we would argue that there are discoveries in science that validate the idea of God's existence, that demonstrate the credibility of the creation accounts. And we're employing kind of this idea of developing a scientific model and developing a set of predictions as a way to illustrate or to show the credibility of that position. But unlike the Discovery Institute, we don't have as our objective of reworking the way science education is done or trying to overthrow the operation of science. I think as a Christian and as a scientist, I find methodological naturalism as unduly restrictive. However, I don't think our objective at Reasons to Believe is necessarily to overthrow, again, that particular framework for science, but rather our agenda is very different than the Discovery Institute's.
So you said there was.
Jack, we got to move on a little bit. I got to get Dragon here. If we have time later on, I'll bring it back in. But I wanted to comment.
Yeah,
that,
Jack, we can't discuss
hang on,
new
Joe.
topics and stuff. So go ahead, Steve.
Hang on, Joe. I wanted to say that one thing I do like about Reasons.
One more comment in here before we end.
Well, yeah. We got a few more minutes. I still got to get a few more people in here, but I wanted to say that I did want to recognize that Reasons to Believe does at least try to do predictive modeling of some sorts. They try to have predictions, and as Fuzz noted, he admitted that they will change things according.
I thought you were moving to topic on.
Hang on, Joe. I just wanted to comment, but I wanted to say that a lot of other places won't do that, right? They'll have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis doesn't pan out, right? And they don't revise their hypothesis. So I'm glad that Fuzz actually acknowledged that, and I find that is something to be noted. But Drag, you had a question that Sam the scientist had wanted to relate via proxy.
Yeah. I'm basically here as Sam the scientist proxy. He's in a Skype call right now with some colleagues. So this is going back at the beginning of the conversation. He wanted to ask, consider this is for Dr. Fuzz. Your allegation is that humans are created in the image of God. Therefore, it follows that human design is a derivation of divine design. It then seems that your philosophical / research program is deeply flawed. You cannot suddenly go from human design to divine design. That doesn't follow. We have good reason to believe that. In fact, this heuristic should be poor. Humans are imperfect beings while God is perfect. We don't know how a perfect being would design anything. We only know how imperfect beings design things. The same line of reasoning applies to the omnipotence of God versus the limited power of humans. We don't know anything about how an omnipotent designer would design things.
Well, in a sense, what I did is I followed in the footsteps again of William Paley, who basically, with his watchmaker analogy, argued that a watch has certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. And again, he used this term that I really like, where he described a watch as a contrivance. And then he surveyed biological systems and noted that those systems too appear to be contrivances as well. And in fact, noting similarities, again, between human designs and biological design. So I don't think my approach is essentially a novel approach. It's essentially a derivative approach from what William Paley did. But then from that, Paley was able to draw certain conclusions. For example, if you're starting from the bottom up as opposed to the top down, and you note that there are similarities between human designs and in this instance, biochemical designs, I think it's reasonable to conclude that perhaps there is a resonance between the way that a human designer works and the designer that brought life into existence. And that finds explanation in the concept of the image of God, that human beings are made in the image of God. But, one of the things that I find, astounding, for example, is that the enzymes that manipulate DNA, let's say during the process of DNA replication, are literally functioning like an ensemble of Turing machines. And in fact, that similarity between, what these enzymes are doing in DNA replication and Turing machines is so profound that it literally is the inspiration for an area of nanotechnology now called DNA computing, where the computers are being built in, Eppendorf test tubes using enzymes in DNA molecules. So, that's an instance where, again, we know that as human beings, we build computers theoretically on the basis of the work of Alan Turing and this idea of these Turing machines, and the fact that we see physical instantiations of those inside the cell, again, is really provocative. And
for example, the fact that we're created in the image of God, we shouldn't be surprised that we're finding piston engines and rotary engines inside the cell, and we should expect that they're going to be better than the machines we make. In fact, they are. And by looking into biology, for example, we're able to improve on our human designs and come up. And so, again, I think this fits very well our theology that we're created in the image of God.
I'm going to ask a question that actually Helena Hambasket actually wanted to ask. She wasn't able to join us today. She was here last time you were here, if you remember. Her matter of fact, she had asked you the question, Hugh, about I can't remember the exact question she asked, but you actually liked it, and you had noted it on one of your other seminars. But the question was basically along the lines is how much of evolutionary theory, when it comes to humans, that you accept, because people are asking in the live feed too about common descent, and if I read it correctly from Reasons to Believe, they do take a literal interpretation of Adam and Eve, literally God breathing dust, from into the dust of the ground and creating human, not from some kind of hominid lineage. Is that how I read the reasons to believe page and their belief?
Yes, but there's more to it than that, in the sense that we believe that with the higher animals, and especially with human beings, there's a non-physical component to our entity. So we're not just purely physical. Like birds and mammals, for example, are physical and soulish, and we human beings are physical, soulish, and spiritual. And in response to your question, how much common descent do we accept? We do accept some. We just don't think common descent is adequate an answer to why the fossil record looks the way it does. We see many instances where you need something beyond nature to explain why we see this record of life's history.
General, did you want to touch on this, because you've been waiting to actually take it from a theistic evolutionist point of view, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So this is the book that Hugh and Fuz wrote in 2004, Origins of Life. And at the end, now I just want to clarify the prediction that they make in their model. So at the end of the book, they say how life appeared early and rapidly. And then finally, why life was so abundant and diverse for the past 3.8 billion years. And then directed panspermia, which I think, Hugh, you're saying that the only explanation is supernaturally directed panspermia. And so here's a book that was written in 2004. And here's a paper that was published last October that confirms the prediction that life on Earth likely started 4.1 billion years, much earlier than scientists thought. So would this be an example, Hugh, of the model of RTB earlier on in your publication? And then I've noticed even in your podcast that you then pick up on this and go, oh, look, see, the model is predicting things, but hence the predictions are coming from data from the Bible, because the biblical, like verse 2 of Genesis 1 is allowing you to make these type of predictions.
Right, although we'd be cautious not to just cite one paper, but to look at the whole range of papers being published on the date for the origin of life. And so what I'm seeing in this recent scientific literature is, in terms of life that remains abundant with longevity on planet Earth, that doesn't start until about 3.825 billion years ago. But it's possible, and I wouldn't say it's probable, but possible, that we have flashes of life that occur earlier, because we do know, but based on zircons, that there are brief moments when you got liquid water on the face of the Earth, and if the Creator is really wanting to aggressively get things happening in the chemistry of the atmosphere, I can see a rationale for bringing life on the Earth, even though it's not going to last very long or be very abundant. But I would argue that that jury is still out. So we're waiting to see what the scientific literature would present, and we're prepared to structure an origin of life model accordingly. But it does seem like there's now a strong consensus that in terms of abundant life that permanently remains on the Earth, that begins about 3.825 billion years ago. The latest error bar I've seen in that is 0.006 billion. There's been a lot of question about that particular paper that makes that claim, but a book I just brought out, Improbable Planet, has a whole chapter analyzing that debate, and I think the paper's result really does stand.
Hugh, would you say that panspermia would be probably the omega point as far as proving God's existence, apart from all the other fine-tuning arguments you make? Would you say that at the end of the day, panspermia is definitely a win or lose situation as far as God is concerned, purely from a scientific context?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're getting at, but we do talk about panspermia in 3 of our books, and making the point that that's not an adequate mechanism for bringing the required chemistry to the surface of the Earth to explain the origin of life from a naturalistic perspective. I wouldn't say it's make or break, because our model would allow for the possibility of the creator to take those transported chemicals and do something with them. On the other hand, there's very strong evidence that those chemicals were not present on the early Earth. Moreover, we can't even find a source of those chemicals anywhere out there in outer space. So for example, we've yet to find ribose or any of the nucleosides or any of the basic amino acids and even the densest molecular clouds that are out there. Now, as an astronomer, I expect we will eventually find them, just because we know the chemistry in those molecular clouds should make those chemicals, but they're going to be making them at probably less than parts per billion. And if we're talking only parts per billion with a rapid rate of destruction of those chemicals once they're formed, then that's not going to help any naturalistic model for the origin of life, far from it.
Thanks, Hugh.
Wayne, I'm going to get you in real quick because, again, you helped organize this. Then if we have time, I don't know how much time we have left with you gentlemen. I do want to get Joe Sansi back in a little bit and Frank Steiner. So, again, we started a little late, so hopefully we have a little more time. But Wayne, what was your question? Wayne? Wayne?
You gotta unmute, Wayne.
Hey guys, can you guys see me?
Yep.
All right. So basically, my question would be, I know you guys were talking about methodological naturalism and how your model is more supernatural and et cetera. And with me being a former science teacher and a Christian, I actually don't mind methodological naturalism. I don't mind having a naturalistic model. And what I would actually challenge you and Fuz, I would ask you, how do you prove something without using a naturalistic methodology? Because that's how science works. Once you go outside of like natural, we can't test it. And so I actually have been, me in general, we have a creation model ourselves, but I will go and I would say I'm more of a theistic naturalist where God works through natural processes that he never breaks the laws of physics. How would you guys respond to that?
Well, we would argue that science is powerful enough to not only test natural hypotheses, but supernatural hypotheses as well. That's something we take a lot of care to explain in our books, where we can use the scientific method to, quote, put God in a test tube.
In terms of the way I think about the whole issue of methodological naturalism is I like to define myself as a soft methodological naturalist, in that I think it's perfectly reasonable as a Christian to start off with the assumption that phenomena will have some kind of natural process explanation. And of course, that's completely compatible with Christian theology because, Wayne, as you're pointing out, there's this concept of providence where God, is putting in place processes within nature that allow nature or the creation to sustain itself. That there are descriptions of God's work as creator where it's clear that God is employing, again, natural processes to bring about his creative purposes. And to me, I would say that if we can explain phenomena through natural processes, that's well and good, and I don't see those explanations as any way, shape, or form contradicting the idea of God having a purpose or undergirding what we see within creation. But I do think there are instances in science where that approach, that methodological, naturalistic approach, does run into a brick wall. In my area, it would be the origin of life. There's not an explanation for the origin of life. There's plenty of ideas out there. There's been 60 plus years of work on the origin of life question, but there's really not been any genuine progress in our understanding of the origin of life. And in fact, one of the themes of my book, Creating Life in the Lab, is that what seems to be coming out of work in prebiotic chemistry is the central role intelligent agency plays in identifying in making chemical and physical processes productive in the laboratory that in principle could conceivably contribute to the origin of life. And in fact, that seems to be pointing to the necessity of intelligent agency in bringing about the origin of life itself. So this is a place where that approach of methodological naturalism seems to be running into a brick wall. and that there's other indications that suggest intelligent agency may have played a role. And I think it's at that point that, as Hugh pointed out, that we can posit perhaps a role of a creator and then devise ways to test that idea. And that's, in a sense, part and parcel of what we've done in books like Origins of Life. And that's where the cell's design fits into the picture, because if indeed a creator has brought life into existence, then we'd expect to see some kind of telltale signature or fingerprint for that creator's work. And what I'm trying to do in the cell's design is develop a way to point out how we could conceivably detect that fingerprint for design.
But to address Frank's point, the cell's design is like a chapter in your Origins of Life book.
Exactly. It's a small, it's a necessary but a small slice of a much larger picture. I think it does function in a standalone context, as it represents, again, I would say, a scientifically informed philosophical / theological argument for God's existence, again, following in the footsteps of William Paley. But in the broader context, it's a way in which we're trying to, in a disciplined manner, demonstrate that we see evidence for God's fingerprints in the created order.
I'm gonna turn it over to Jade real quick, because she's a theist as well, and I could kind of get her input on this as well, because she's a theist evolutionist. But Jade, you've been listening this entire time. So what do you think when it comes to the position that you can merge the intelligent design, science, theistic evolution, biology? How do all these things mix together, Jade?
Well, my point of view, and by the way, hello, gentlemen. It's really nice to be here with you. Yeah, I'm a Roman Catholic, and the way I look at things is I think that God had the plan in mind all along, and basically it just started with the Big Bang and proceeded naturally, because that is God's plan. Now, of course, I could be wrong. I have no problem admitting that. Interesting. I find this an interesting discussion, and I clearly have to catch up on your books. When you say that science isn't limited to, I've always looked at science as being a investigation into the natural world. So how do you define supernatural? And I guess that's what I'm really interested in. If science can actually be used to test the supernatural, how do you define supernatural?
That's a very good question. And, in my book, More Than a Theory, I make the point that from a biblical perspective, God's got a tool chest of supernatural interventions. One we would refer to as transcendent miracles, where God operates outside the laws of physics and the space-time dimensions. And an example where we can establish that scientifically would be the origin of the universe. Through the space-time theorems, we know that the causal agent operated from outside of matter, energy, space, and time. But far more frequently, the Bible talks about God intervening through transformational miracles, where he doesn't violate the laws of physics or the space-time dimensions. He works within them in the same way that we human beings work within these laws of physics. So, for example, we can go out to some area and we can mine iron ore and aluminum ore, and we can take that and transform it into an automobile. We've not violated the laws of physics. On the other hand, what we produce is something that the simple operation of those laws of physics without intelligent intervention would never produce. And so we look for examples of that in the natural record. And I think what's crucial there is not just to see, okay, this is extremely improbable from, natural processes working without any kind of guidance, but as the outcome, something that serves the specific purpose of the Creator God in the Bible. Look at what the Bible teaches about God's plans for the present and the future. Okay, what we're seeing here is not only extremely improbable with unguided natural process, but also serves a very highly specified function that's mentioned in the scriptures. Then we feel that we're warranted in calling that a transformational miracle. However, we see the need to take that claim and put it to the test through further experiments and observations.
Joe, I'm going to turn it back over to Joe. Joe had a follow-up question. He really wanted to get back into this. So, Joe, go ahead and ask any question you want.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is going back quite a bit, but earlier you guys were talking or emphasizing the fact that you guys are presenting a different paradigm from intelligent design. Now, the common criticism of the intelligent design movement is just how staggeringly vague it is just to say that, oh, there's a designer and he's intelligent. But you guys are actually making a specific, much more specific argument. You're saying the God of the Bible is the designer. But this was briefly mentioned. This, of course, opens you up to the problem of poor design, right? It seems like that's a part of the paradigm or the argument against Christian theism, that is the problem of evil. Do you guys think that your scientific hypothesis also has to run into the problem of evil? Because it seems to me like there's plenty of design out there that just ultimately results in horrible amounts of pain and suffering. I mean, the biological food web itself seems like it's just a perpetuation of all these terrible instances of death, and it's happened for hundreds of millions of years. How do you guys grapple with the fact that the design paradigm that you guys are offers one which I guess describes a designer who seems disinterested in the plight of all these animals that have died for hundreds of millions of years?
Just real quick, a lot of what we write about and the types of resources that we develop actually are addressing those very kinds of questions. So in the Cells Design, there's an entire chapter devoted to the idea of bad designs and biochemical systems, and how can we think of those systems, you know, from a context that sees that designer as the God of the Bible. And so we do grapple and take those issues very seriously, but I don't think that those issues are a defeater for a model whatsoever.
Matter of fact,
well, the issue about it's not even a bad design. It's actually it sounds to me like it's the design that's being made. So to call it bad isn't the issue. Frank, there's an echo.
Okay.
Yeah, Frank, I think you have the video playing. That's causing an echo.
Okay, well,
okay.
One more comment.
Okay, so
yeah, I'm still getting an echo, Frank.
Okay.
Yeah,
we'll figure out Frank's technical problem soon in a second. He might have the video playing in the background.
a crucial part of our model is the problem of evil. We've actually written 2 entire books on the problem of evil, making the point, for example, that the laws of physics themselves are designed by the creator with the problem of evil in mind. I mean, and I love your comment that because we're coming up with a specific identification of the creator, we can develop a detailed, testable creation model. That's one of our critiques of the intelligent design movement. It's so vague, they really can't build a model that can be scientifically put to the test in any significant way. But for example, Christianity teaches a 2 creation model, that God creates the universe with its highly fine-tuned laws of physics as tools in the creator's hands to eliminate evil once and for all, while at the same time enhancing the free will capability of human beings. And once that has been achieved, the Bible tells us God will replace his universe with a brand new realm with radically different laws of physics. Talks about the different physics, the different dimensions, and that can all be in play because it's a realm where evil no longer is even a possibility, in spite of the fact of enhanced human free will. But because we need gravity to be exactly the way it is, and thermodynamics to be exactly the way it is, in order to bring about the end of all evil while enhancing human free will, you're going to get things like tornadoes and earthquakes, wildfires, viruses, disease. However, we write in our books that in the context of the laws of physics that the creator chose, those are all optimized to minimize the suffering that humans and animals experience in the context of those laws of physics. So the
But that's not consistent with God's omnibenevolence, right?
Pardon me?
Because God could just, that's not consistent with God's omnibenevolence. Because God could have just created that second world, right? No evil, and there'd be maximum free will right at the outset, right?
No, we're
So if God
arguing
were perfectly good, that's what he would have done, right?
well, God could have done that, but not without giving us free will. Once you
there's
introduce
free will in heaven, right? There's free will in heaven, right?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
There's free
In
will
heaven-
in heaven, right?
Yeah, in heaven you have free will, I imagine.
So
and
if
it
there's
seems
heaven
like
and free will, then there's no obstacle to there being free will without evil, right? So I don't understand how a perfectly good God would
Hold on, let
create.
him respond. Let him respond. Hold on.
Yeah. Notice that in heaven, the only beings that are there are those that have passed the test of being exposed to the most greatest challenge in the context of evil. And so, only humans who have passed that test get to go.
That doesn't answer the question of why, though.
To go.
That doesn't
So
answer the question of why
Hang on, Jack.
God would do that.
Okay, what you're raising is a contradiction. The idea that God could produce a perfect realm where you have free will and no possibility of evil.
It's not a contradiction. It exists in heaven on your view, right? It's not a contradiction.
Well, it exists in heaven because the only people that are there are those that have been tested in the context of evil.
Question is, why would God have to test people, right, rather than just put people in a world without evil,
In order
right,
that
and
there
give
be a
them free
guarantee.
will?
I mean, let me give you an analogy that might help. Fuz has a PhD. It basically guarantees that never again will he have to be tested for his competency in biochemistry. Why? Because he's already been subjected to the most difficult tests in the context of biochemistry, so there's no need to test him again. And so, likewise, the only way that we could ever have our free will in a state where we're never going to use that free will for evil intent is for that free will to be first put to the test. And that's the purpose of this universe.
No, wait a minute. You're saying that it's impossible for people to perform evil acts in heaven, even though they are free, right? So that means God could have created a world with free beings in it that would never perform evil, right? There's no logical obstacle there. If it can exist in heaven, then God could have created such a world.
I mean,
no, I don't see why it has to be tested, right? You're saying, right, that it's not a contradiction, right, for a person to be free, right, and never perform evil, right? In fact,
Jack, let him respond, because I think we're going a little bit off topic, because we're moving from ID into the theistic approach, and that's not really what the conversation is about.
Well, yeah, but Steve, they said that's what makes their.
Whoa, we're getting feedback.
Yeah, they're saying that their model, Steve, right, it's going to be part of their model, right, that the God that they're proposing as the explanation for all these phenomena, right, is perfectly good, right? Now that should generate certain predictions. It should generate a prediction that we don't encounter evil, and that we don't encounter gratuitous evils at all, right? So I take it straightforwardly that their model should be falsified.
Yeah, Frank, you're killing us. I don't know why you're getting feedback or echo, but there's something, I don't know if the video. But Jack, I think I get the point. Let him respond to this.
Straightforwardly, that their model should therefore be counted as falsified, right? Unless they have some kind of auxiliary hypothesis that they adopt to accommodate the anomalous data, which generates new predictions, right? Which we can then see if they're confirmed or not. So what I'm trying to understand is, given that the model does seem to be straightforwardly falsified by the existence of gratuitous evil, presumably they have some non-ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis that generates novel predictions, right, that are consistent with the amount of evil that we actually see. And I'm just trying to understand how that works.
Okay, let him respond, and then I want to get Paul G in here for a second.
Yeah, and Steve, it might be worth actually doing a whole show on
Yeah, that's what I'm
how the
thinking.
beagle and how it fits into our model.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you because that's a
I mean, these are great questions we're getting.
but it's too much for what we're talking about now, though. I think it would be great for another hangout. Don't you agree, though?
Yeah,
But that's a part of. Isn't that a part of your?
May I make a few last comments?
Sure, Frank.
Okay.
Go ahead, Frank.
All right. So, first of all, I want to thank both of you gentlemen for sort of putting your position out there. Did not realize the difference between reasons to believe and intelligent design. But I want to make 3 points, and then I'm just going to call it quits, I guess. So, one thing I've learned as a scientist and a teacher of science is that I know that I don't know, and I'm okay with that. And I look at science as a process that is investigating new things and making new discoveries and coming up with new explanations. So getting back to the...
Uh-oh. Is he frozen? Or is it me?
Yeah, he froze for me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's concerning because I didn't know if it was me or not. I know we're probably running out of time here, so I'm going to wrap things up a little bit. When Frank comes back, he can say the 3 things because I think he's frozen. Apologia, did you want to chime in real quick? Let me introduce you to Apologia. He actually makes videos refuting young Earth creationism. He does an exceptionally good job. And he wanted to ask you a real quick question in regards to the amber that was found. Remember, we discussed it the other day, and then we'll have to wrap it up after that.
Sure, thanks. And thanks so much, gentlemen. You guys are a tremendous resource for me, for my theist family, and talking about science. To be able to point them to someone who believes in both things has been great. So, Fuz, I've been talking to you a bit on Twitter about the amber, and you've been great to reply. You spoke today about the soulishness that is the... I assume you accept macroevolution based on the feathers and the amber and all that kind of stuff. At what point did dinosaurs then become soulish, and how is that a testable theory? Is that something that the Christians you come up with accept? Like how does this is a new concept for me today, and I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the Bible talks about God creating 3 different kinds of life: life that's purely physical, life that's physical and soulish, and one and only species, namely the human species, that's physical, soulish, and spiritual. The soulish animals are those that are endowed with mind, will, and emotions, with a desire to form relationships with members of their own species. These are species where the parents will sacrifice to care for their young, but they're also species that are motivated to form relationships with human beings and have the capacity to serve and please human beings. It would include all the birds and mammals, and includes just a very limited number of the higher reptilian species. Basically, any species that we can tame to form an emotional bond with us and to serve and please us would be in that category. So, for example, that would include alligators and crocodiles. Very difficult to tame, but it can be done.
But the theropods, so the theropods at some point became soulish, and that is a inheritable trait that was descended down through the line, or is each species endowed with it, or how does that work?
Well, the evidence we have from the dinosaurs is that they do not fit into that category. I mean, they did lay eggs, but we have no tangible evidence that they parents sacrificed to take care of the young. And evidently what we do know is that when they came out of the egg, they seem to be able to take care of themselves.
So at some point then in your model, God endowed the soulishness to birds after they descended from theropods?
Well, it tells us in Genesis 1 that God, he calls the birds and the sea mammals soulish creatures. And then on the creation day 6, it talks about 3 different kinds of land mammals that would also be in that category. You can go to the book of Job and you get some details on what kind of characteristics these animals manifest, but nowhere in the Bible are you going to find a complete list of all the different nephesh or soulish.
Gotcha. I guess I was just wondering when, at what point in history does it happen that an animal goes from non-soulish to soulish? But I'll check out your books and see.
Well, that would certainly apply to the first birds and first mammals.
Okay.
Fuzz, after listen, you said you listened to our discussion the other day with Alex Rubenstahl. Did you get any takeaway from that? Because we had brought you up and we had brought your blog up about the dinosaur tail found. Was there any takeaway from that out of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, well, number one, I really enjoyed the conversation and is very impressed with Alex. So he was a good choice to bring on your program. Just to clarify, I guess, our position and what I brought up in the blog post is we are skeptical about aspects of the evolutionary paradigm and specifically the notion that evolution has the capacity to create novel designs. And so, we allow for the idea that there is limited evolution, but we're just, again, skeptical about the capacity of evolution, again, to create novel designs. So the idea that birds would have evolved from a shared ancestor with the theropods, for example, is something that we would be somewhat skeptical about. And so the way we would look at the case that's being made by evolutionary biologists for that shared ancestry is largely, again, based on shared anatomical features. And we would argue that those shared features could be understood as reflecting common design as opposed to necessarily common descent. And in a nutshell, we would kind of follow after the way Sir Richard Owen interpreted homologies. He was, a prominent biologist prior to Darwin in the UK who was key in actually defining and describing homologies and developed this model where he viewed the homologies as reflecting an archetypical design that existed in the mind of the first cause. And so we would think about those shared features in those terms. And, the one point that I do bring up in my blog, and I've brought this up elsewhere, and this is not a criticism that is novel to me or unique to me, but it's something I've seen people like Alan Fiducia, who you guys mentioned, maybe not in so kind terms on the program last week, but following after Alan Fiducia, he pointing out the idea of a temporal paradox that would appear just to be, again, transitional with regard to the feathers or the feathered theropods consistently show up in the fossil record after the appearance of the first true birds and the first evidence for modern flight feathers. And so I find that to be somewhat problematic. I understand the idea that the fossil record is incomplete, and I understand the idea that, the argument would be that, these feathers that are found in the amber, would essentially reflect kind of an ancestral state that just persevered for, whatever, 50 million, 60 million years. But the problem is that it's not really clear if you can necessarily interpret things that way exclusively. And what I mean by that is, let me go to an example I'm a little bit more familiar with. And that would have to do with the idea that humans and chimps share, from an evolutionary perspective, a common ancestor. And, for quite some time among anthropologists, people viewed chimpanzees as being an ancestral state. That is, that humans and chimps emerge from a shared ancestor that would have been some kind of knuckle-walking quadruped, and that the human hand is actually an evolutionary derived state. The chimpanzee hand is actually, an ancestral state. Well, in recent years, that idea has been completely turned upside down, where people are now suggesting that the knuckle-walking quadrupedal nature of chimps is actually a derived state. It's not an ancestral state, that the human hand is actually a primitive state, not a derived state, and the chimp hand is a derived state. And so the problem is that when you look at, presumably again, creatures that diverge from a common ancestor, and then you try to ascribe, whether or not a state is ancestral or it's a derived state, can be very problematic. And when you apply that again to the feathers found in amber, attached to the dinosaur tail, how do you know that that's a derived state? Maybe that's, an ancestral state. Maybe it's a derived state. And how do you know that it may not have even emerged independently in that particular lineage, as opposed to, again, being ancestral? I don't think you can answer those questions unless you have something in the fossil record that precedes the appearance of the very first true feathers. And so the fact that you see a temporal paradox, to me, is problematic from that standpoint. I didn't elaborate very much in the blog. It was just meant to be a very quick response to the discovery.
Maybe when we have Dr. Schweitzer come in, maybe we'll get Alex as well, and you, and we'll kind of like have a hangout. Just
I'm no expert
I'm sort of back.
in dinosaurs, but I'd love to be participating in that program because I have spent quite a bit of time looking at the issue of soft tissue remnants with dinosaurs, and just as a biochemist offering some thoughts as to how is it possible for those soft tissue remnants to persist.
Frank, did you want to do a rejoinder real quick, and then Sam had a question. Then I think we're going to wrap it up. So
final comments. I don't know what happened to my connection. It just dematerialized. But I just want to make 3 points quick. I don't know if you heard my comment about this whole idea of science is a process, and as a scientist, I know that I don't know. And just because when I come to a particular point in the research where we don't understand things, how they are working or what's involved, we don't come up with some sort of like skyhook explanation, and it's intelligently designed. The second point I wanted to make is that I do appreciate Dr. Fonek and Dr. Ross explaining the difference between reasons to believe versus ID. But I would sort of classify what they're describing as sort of supernatural scientism. And I think the problem with that is that you are the people that are deciding what the role of God or the designer is playing. You are taking the role of God. You are taking the role of divine providence, which I don't think anyone is capable of doing. No one is capable of knowing the mind of God or even trying to make predictions based on what the mind of God would or is. And I think actually some people of various religious communities would actually be offended because they would actually think in some ways that might even be construed as sacrilegious. The last thing I wanted to make as comment is about science and what the process of science is about. And it's not necessarily about finding truth per se, although that various types of truth can come out of science. But the real purpose of science is to make predictions. And so what I've heard here today doesn't really go about making predictions from a scientific perspective. It's introducing an outside influence in terms of the predictions. And so that would mean sort of my final critique on the discussions for today.
Thank you, Frank. By the way, I really wanted to thank you for joining us. I had got in touch with him a few days ago and worked out him coming on to act as a sounding board because he was well familiar with your book. So I wanted to thank Frank for that very much. I do know we got to end this soon. I do want to get, if I could get one last question, if I may. I know you guys probably are on a limited time, but Sam, I wanted you to jump on real quick. I'm sure they remember you from last time. Go ahead and jump in real quick. And like I said, then we're probably going to have to wrap it up a little bit.
Well, it's just something that I noticed about Fuz's language, and this is going to sound very harsh, and I do apologize in advance. So you have the advanced apology, but it's kind of a slimy tactic that he tends to use, which is that he'll refer to something being a possibility rather than, there's sort of this weird switch where on the one hand, he will look at, he'll characterize, for example, the idea of derived traits, right, which he just did. And he'll talk about, well, it's so difficult to find derived traits, which, in fairness, it is. And, he'll talk about all of these caveats there. And then he kind of uses, as a rhetorical trick almost, the fact that in science, there's a basic fact. We're not certain of everything, right? We're just constructing the best models that we can at the time. And then it kind of seems like, and from the bits and pieces that I've heard of this, because I had a meeting with a colleague, unfortunately, not fortunate, it was a good meeting, but about an hour ago, is that at the same time he fails to elucidate what his model entails. And I noticed this in some of the writing that I've read of his, where it's this little trick where there's this casting of doubt on current scientific models, which is in fairness easy to do, right? Science is built off of doubt. It's built off of incomplete hypotheses. But at the same time, I don't see anything in the way of detail coming from either the intelligent design community, the young earth creationist community, the reason to believe community. And so the thing I would ask is, like, why is there this asymmetry? It's easy to sort of delve into the literature and find, oh, look, there's this, piece of doubt of whatever size, but at the same time they've got the gaping hole of not even, as Frank brilliantly pointed out, not even doing science. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's, as Wolfgang Pauli would say, not even wrong. So I mean, I missed a good 45 to 50 minutes of this conversation, so they might have said something where they actually outlined, a mechanistic explanation where I could go into the lab, that I'm looking at right now and test. But is there anything along those lines? Because it seems like we're kind of playing an unfair game here, where you're allowed to throw, a little bit of doubt, and then the second that we question, your mechanisms, you can go, well, oh no, I'm only referring to a possibility.
Well, okay, let me respond to that. And we did have a long discussion about the idea that we are proposing predictions about what should be discovered, scientifically speaking, if our creation model is indeed valid. So we are making an attempt to put our ideas within harm's way. And we are working to try to make things as specific as possible. But, when you're positing the idea that there's an intelligent agency involved in bringing about a particular facet of nature, the idea of what is the mechanism may not necessarily be a valid question. I remember having a conversation with a patent lawyer a number of years ago, and we were discussing the idea, that very idea. When somebody invents something, what is the mechanism for the invention, right? That's really almost an absurd question. There's not a mechanism when somebody invents as such, right? Because it's an idea that emerges from that individual's thinking. And so the idea that you see evidence for design or God's fingerprints in nature, or you're arguing that God is intervening at a particular place in life's history, there may not be a mechanism involved necessarily. Again, depending on the nature of how God is intervening. But we actually have a number of articles on our website, and one of which I participated in writing, and it has to do with a concept called hypernaturalism. A physicist and a theologian who are part of our team at Reasons to Believe as volunteers introduced this concept of hypernaturalism, where they're arguing that God could very well create primarily through the laws of nature. And this is a point that Lane brought up earlier, and that you could distinguish between a strict unguided process and one in which God is involved, because highly improbable things happen, highly unusual events happen at the just right time with the just right magnitude and the just right
function and purpose.
Right, yes. And so, but in that instance, you could actually posit a mechanism. So when it comes to the origin of life, I'm often asked, I think God intervened to bring about the origin of life. Well, I'm asked, what does that look like? Well, I look at work that's happened in prebiotic chemistry, work in synthetic biology, and it's interesting to me that, I'm of the opinion that there's not any violation of the laws of chemistry and physics that would take place to bring about the origin of life. In other words, all the chemistry and the physics that we need in principle for chemical evolution exists within nature. But what prebiotic chemistry has shown us is that those processes happen very well under laboratory conditions when you have organic chemists very carefully rigging the chemistry and the experimental setup in such a way that the chemistry is productive. But as soon as you translate that chemistry to the conditions of the early Earth, it's not going to be productive in the early Earth environment. In fact, many origin of life researchers recognize this as being a very real problem that they're confronted with as they try to translate insights from prebiotic chemistry to the origin of life question. But what's evident is that you have organic chemists that are manipulating the laws of nature to bring about their particular purposes. That is, they're functioning hypernaturally, or and so the question is, could God have brought about the origin of life through a hypernatural collection of miracles where there was no laws of nature violated? I think that's a distinct possibility where you could actually study that process mechanistically, but yet you'd still recognize it as being miraculous. So that's one possibility that I actually probably lean towards in large measure. But it's also conceivable that God could simply have done something where it would be more akin to an inventor developing an invention where there's not a mechanism involved, where there's just an instantiation. So to me, where I think you see us as not being specific, we are making attempts to develop predictions that are, at this juncture, in some instances broad-based, but we are looking at making more and more specific predictions, as we work on these particular problems. And part of what we're doing is exploring, in a sense, the mode by which God brought about his creative purposes. So, I think we are trying to be
Well, we're also
specific.
getting more and more specific as we learn more and more about the record of nature,
Right.
and also what the Bible is communicating. We're able to develop a more specific case. And so that's, again, why we bring out numerous editions of our books, is to actually demonstrate the increasing specificity.
I can respond to that. The first thing, and this is going to sound kind of tongue-in-cheek, but patent lawyers are not biochemists, nor are they philosophers of science. I am the child of two lawyers.
But they are people that are experts in essentially describing invention.
Well, no, cognitive psychologists who study creativity would be experts. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I actually wrote down some notes. If I was on camera, I'd show you. But there actually are works by cognitive psychologists on the process of creativity and what brainwaves and what neurological processes actually underlie these things. Now, we're far from anything resembling a detailed picture, but to say, oh, it just comes out of nowhere, I mean, that's,
but
I'm sorry, that's not,
but I would say that
it's a silly thing to say, to be honest.
Sam, could I ask you a question? Would you say that, like, the positing that it's designed by something or created by something, it's a lot more substantial if you have background information, background knowledge of the designer, right?
That's what I'm going to get to, right? Like,
exactly.
And I've given this example. I have an iPhone right in front of me, right? I can look at all of these signatures, all of these things. I can look at the history of Apple technologies. I can look at just there are instant hypotheses generated when I posit that Apple designed this phone based on, as Joe said, background information. If we're not talking about something mechanistic, if we're not talking about something fundamentally that we can look into, then we're not talking science. And I'm not saying that to bash what you're saying. I'm saying that as just a point of fact, right? This is the same as when people used to posit, that there was some sort of, vital force behind what defines what's living and what's not, right? It's not that it's right or not that it's wrong. It's that it just isn't even in the realm of conceivability. And so what I kind of found right with what you said is something that I find massively problematic if we're going to talk about this on a scientific basis, because it seems like a great deal of your epistemological project there is retrofitting your philosophy and your theology to fit reality.
Sam, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because you said something that was kind of funny. I think you said if you can't put it in the test tube, or if you're talking about like some type of like force, it's not science. Would you agree with this sentence? The universe.
That's not what I said, though.
I would like to hear what our guests have to say to what Sam
Yeah.
just said, actually.
Because I don't think I've said anything that's, well, I just want to say this isn't a personal attack. This isn't anything like that. But I don't think I'm saying anything terribly controversial when it comes to the realms of cognitive psychology, when it comes to the realms of doing science, or it comes to the realms of philosophy of science.
Well, you're assuming that we don't have background for our model. And I like your analogy of the iPhone. You can look at the iPhone and there's certain things you can learn about that. You know the background of Apple technology, and you can build a model on that basis. I think that's an apt analogy for what we're doing at Reasons to Believe. I mean, we have the Bible, and we can develop some background on that and look at the natural realm and see if the model we build out of the Bible actually fits what we're seeing in the natural realm, develop predictions, both biblically and scientifically, and see how it plays out. So I don't see that any different than what you would do.
Well, there is a difference. There is a difference, which is that you're starting from a God whose intentions you're trying to discern, right? And so it's going to be God's intentions, right, that ultimately explain what he communicates to the authors of the Bible that he's presumably inspiring on your model, right? But you can't appeal to background knowledge about gods, right, to allow the authors of the Bible to correctly interpret God's communications. So I just don't see how God's communications can be interpreted at all. That's the key disanalogy there.
Well, the difference is that the Bible has predictive power.
In the case of other types of design inferences, right, we do actually have background information about the nature of putative designers, right, the ones that are being postulated. But see, in the case of a god, the background information that you have is presumably derived from Scripture, right? And you're caught in a kind of circular argument by using Scripture, right, to tell us what facts we know about the nature of the Creator, right, to allow us to interpret what the Creator's intentions are. So
let him address that, then we're going to have to rack it up, Jack.
Yeah.
So go ahead and address that.
Example in science, though, where we are looking for evidence for intelligent agency where we don't have any background information whatsoever, and that would involve the search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
No, that point was already addressed by Joe earlier. You never actually responded to it, which is that there can't actually be intrinsic hallmarks of design because it's consistent with the existence of there being an intelligent designer, that it could create things any old way, right? It could create things that are complex. It could create things that are simple, right? So it doesn't actually follow from the fact that we encounter anything, right? That it
complexity
exists
and
hallmarks
simplicity, I don't think, are
apart
necessarily
from the background assumptions.
right.
Right.
But I don't think simplicity and complexity are what we're arguing as markers.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is that a creator, right, could, especially an omnipotent one, could choose to create anything whatsoever. So the fact that we encounter something, right, cannot license an inference to the fact that there's a designer, simplicator, right, because the designer, the hypothesis of a designer doesn't generate the predictive expectation of any type of object that exhibits any type of properties, right? all observations are consistent with that hypothesis, right? And so when you have a hypothesis on which all possible observable outcomes are equiprobable on the hypothesis, you have a hypothesis for which there cannot be evidence, right? That's the objection that Joe was posing before that he didn't respond to. Appeal to hallmarks of design, right? When it's consistent with the hypothesis of a designer that the exact opposite properties that you are claiming are hallmarks of design are consistent with the possible actions of that designer.
All right, Jack, let him respond because we do have to wrap it up. So I'm gonna give them a little response to that, then allow them to wrap it up, and then I'll wrap it up. So
Yeah, I'll make a brief comment and let Fuz
Absolutely.
finish, and that is that the comment is based on a mistaken notion of the designer. The creator God of the Bible isn't a being that can do, quote, anything that's possible. That creator self-limits. For example, is a creator for whom it's impossible to sin or to do anything that's evil. It's a creator that's got a specific purpose for creating the universe and for creating life in human beings. So in that sense, we do have constraints.
Yeah, but those
on the physical
constraints are
model.
those constraints, right, that you're attributing to the designer, to the creator, right, are derived from Scripture. Said in order to be able to interpret Scripture properly, right, you'd have to actually be able to constrain your knowledge. You'd have to actually be able to offer constraints on the nature of the creator independently of Scripture. Otherwise, you're arguing in a circle.
Well, we do that. I mean, the heart of the Christian faith is that God's given us two books of revelation, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. As we've mentioned already, there are things we can see in the book of nature that establish the existence of this transcendent creator. So we're not totally in Scripture.
All right,
Jack,
Jack, we got to move. We've got to move on here. Unfortunately, we can have this type of discussion maybe at a future date, months from now. I just
Do you guys have to go? Could we maybe extend this a little bit longer, because this is a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, maybe you can make it off.
I think we actually have to go. There's a couple things we've got obligations for this.
Oh,
yeah,
sure, yeah.
But we're prepared to
they'll be back again.
Yeah,
we can have it. We can have more on this type of line.
I think you've sent me a link to your YouTube channel, but we have actually people that volunteer with our organization. We call it our volunteer apologist community. And I think I would really like to alert them to, if it's okay with you, to your channel and really encourage them to become involved, because I think many of our people would really enjoy what you're doing and fit in and could even make positive and insightful contributions to what you're doing. So
I would love that. Totally love that. Yeah. I'll send. I gave it to you before, but I don't know if you still have it. But I'll send you the link to the Great Debate Community G+ thing where we all kind of like communicate from. Hopefully both of you will actually join that community. You don't have to spend a lot of time in it, but at least we can actually say that you're officially, great debate community members. Even though you kind of are at this point, because you've been gracious enough to come back quite a few times. But I'm going to give you guys the last word, and then I really am going to have to come just to a close. So please go ahead and finish up, and then, like I said, I'll say the last few things, and then we'll have to end this.
Well, we really do have to go, but we really appreciate this opportunity. We think this is really the methodology that's best for resolving these issues. We need a dialogue approach, not a lecture approach. And thank you for making this possible. And Fuz and I are both willing to come back and get into all these discussions that I think deserve much more attention than we could devote just in these past few minutes. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Happy to come back anytime, and thoroughly enjoyed this opportunity to engage with you guys, and just deeply impressed with the thoughtfulness and really I think the open-mindedness that exists within our interactions within the community here. And Frank, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you both. Nice to spend a little time with you.
Yeah, and so even though we don't agree on things, I really enjoyed interacting with you, and appreciate that opportunity and hopefully get a chance to do that a little bit more.
And all of you have been bringing up great questions. These are the kinds of questions we love to get. So thank you.
And we appreciate it. And I wanted to note, it's not, the purpose of these types of hangouts is not really to put people in the hot seat per se. That does happen, obviously. But like you said, it's to build a dialogue. And both of you have been gracious enough to give your time to establish that dialogue between many different types of organizations. I mean, we all have different positions we take. I'm an agnostic. We have atheists in the room, theists in the room. But I think the dialogue is something we all can have, whatever your theological position is. So I'm going to leave it with that. I want to wish all you guys a very, very happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you want to celebrate. I have listed everybody's names who has been greatly helpful supporting my channel and Patreon, because I do this for Patreon, and just people that want to come here and learn and talk about these subjects. So I've listed you in the description itself. I've also put the links to RTB and to Dr. Steiner's review. Any other links I'll probably add in after that. But anyways, I really want to thank every one of my listeners. We had about 50 people watching consistently. These videos usually get about 1,000 to 2,000 views overall. Hopefully that'll go up to maybe 3,000 or 5,000 as time progresses. But anyways, Dr. Rana, Dr. Ross, thank you once again for joining us. This has been a pleasure as always. We can't thank you enough for taking the time to coming in here and putting forth your positions and having it challenged by many different people from many different ways. So I'm gonna end the broadcast now. We're gonna have a little after show, guys, afterwards. I know they can't stick around, but if you guys want to do a action, what a drag call, an action after report, we're gonna be doing that. So anyways, God bless, take care everyone, and hope you have a Merry Christmas.